It's funny, isn't it? You know how we kind of take free speech for granted in the U.S.? It just feels so basic, like it's in the air we breathe.
Right.
But lately, I've been thinking about, like, all these news stories about, I think they were Indian scholars, Rajini Srinivasan and Badar Khan Suri.
Mm-hmm.
And they were here, living their lives, presumably with all the right paperwork and visas. And all of a sudden, they're facing, like, those visas being revoked and potentially deportation because of the opinions they shared that were seen as, supportive of Hamas.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like if you're here in the U.S., maybe working, studying, visiting family, do you just automatically assume that the First Amendment, that whole freedom of speech thing,
Mm-hmm.
applies to you exactly the same way as someone with a U.S. passport?
Oh, that's such a great question to start with. And it makes me think about how different countries view this whole idea of free speech, Like, for example, India.
Oh, interesting.
Their constitution, specifically Article 19, Clause 1, subsection A, it's very clear. Freedom of speech and expression is a right only for citizens of India.
So black and white, huh?
Yeah, like you're either a citizen and you have this right or you're not. No gray areas.
Right, right. But then you look at our First Amendment and it just says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
Yeah.
No mention of citizen anywhere, just the freedom of speech.
Mm.
It almost makes you think it should apply to anyone here in the U.S., doesn't it?
Definitely gives that impression.
So that's what we really want to explore today.
Okay.
Like, do people who aren't U.S. citizens but are here legally have the same free speech protections as citizens? What does the information we have actually say about this?
Well, on the surface, it seems like the answer should be a pretty simple yes, right? I mean, there are arguments out there, and even cases in practice, that suggest folks with valid visas can speak their minds without immediate consequences.
Hmm.
And there have even been times when undocumented immigrants have successfully used the First Amendment for protection.
Like, for instance,
Well, for instance, the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University has expressed concern that the government's response to some pro-Palestine student protests might actually be unconstitutional,
oh, wow.
which implies that these protections aren't strictly for citizens.
Okay, so that's the initial thought, right? Like, you're free to say what you think, get involved in discussions, even protest, and the First Amendment's got your back no matter what. But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
And, honestly, a bit concerning.
I'm listening.
It turns out the government has other ways to deal with speech they don't like.
Really?
They don't necessarily have to pass a law specifically targeting non-citizen speech.
I see.
They've got immigration laws, which they can use as a kind of tool to manage what people say.
So it's not about outright banning certain speech, but more about the consequences of that speech.
Exactly. Think about Srinivasan and Suri again. The government isn't going after them for the content of their speech directly.
Right.
They're using their immigration status.
Interesting tactic.
It's almost like saying, we don't like what you said, so we're taking away your permission to be here.
So they're not saying you can't say it, which might be unconstitutional, but they're using their power over your ability to stay in the country as a consequence.
Right. It's like a workaround, isn't it?
It really is.
We're not stopping you from talking. They're saying, we're just stopping you from being here while you do it.
A subtle but significant difference.
And the thing is, this isn't new, right? It's not some recent tactic that just popped up.
You think there's a historical precedent for this?
Our sources show that this kind of approach has been around for a long time. And looking at some of those historical examples can really help us understand how this whole thing has played out over the years.
That makes sense. So the tension we see today, it has roots in the past?
Absolutely. Our sources reveal a whole history of the U.S. government using similar strategies.
Let's dive into those key moments then.
Perfect. Let's go back in time a bit, shall we?
Sounds good.
One of the clearest and honestly kind of shocking examples comes from way back when the U.S. was still pretty new.
Oh.
The Alien Enemies Act of 1798, passed under President John Adams. This law actually let the government imprison non-citizens who were seen as threats or even just critical of the government.
Wow, just for speaking out against the government.
That's right. Imagine that being locked up just for expressing your opinion. And this was before, like, indoor plumbing was even a common thing.
That's a powerful image.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, here we are establishing these grand ideals of freedom, and at the same time, there's a law that lets you imprison someone just for disagreeing with you.
A stark contrast indeed.
And then fast forward to the 1950s, the Red Scare.
Right. A very different era.
Our sources point out how non-citizens with any past ties to communist organizations were quickly deported.
That's a familiar story.
And the key here is that they were being punished for things that weren't even against the law when they did them.
You mean like associating with certain groups?
Exactly. Someone like Robert Galvin, for example, could be deported years later for something that wasn't illegal at the time.
That raises serious questions about fairness, doesn't it? Like, the rules of the game can change, even retroactively, for those who aren't citizens.
It's unsettling, for sure. And then moving closer to our own time, the 1990s, we have the case of Reno v. American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee.
Okay, I'm familiar with that one.
8 Palestinian activists legally living in the U.S. were targeted for their political views.
And what happened?
Well, the Supreme Court ruled that these individuals couldn't use the argument of selective enforcement to defend themselves against deportation.
So even if they felt they were being singled out for their speech, while others doing similar things weren't being punished.
It wasn't a valid defense.
Interesting. Can you elaborate on selective enforcement a bit?
Sure. It's the idea that if a law isn't being applied equally to everyone breaking it, then enforcing it against one specific person might be unfair or discriminatory.
Makes sense.
In this case, the Supreme Court essentially limited the ability of non-citizens facing deportation to argue they were being unfairly targeted because of their speech.
Okay, I see.
It's a pretty significant restriction.
And the court didn't explicitly rule on the full extent of First Amendment protections for non-citizens with visas.
Nope. What's fascinating here is how the Supreme Court, without directly addressing the full scope of First Amendment rights for non-citizens with valid visas, essentially gave the government a lot of leeway when it comes to enforcing immigration laws.
Even when speech seems to be the main reason for action.
Exactly.
So we've got this situation where the Constitution seems broad and inclusive, but history shows the government has consistently found ways to take action against non-citizen speech using immigration laws.
Right. It creates this real tension, this gap between the ideal of free speech for everyone here and the actual limits, especially when your right to be in the country is at stake.
It's like you might technically have free speech rights, but in practice, there's this looming threat of those rights being undermined through immigration measures.
That's a really good way to put it. So what does this mean for our listeners? What should they take away from all this?
Well, if you're not a U.S. citizen, or if you know people who aren't, understanding this historical and legal context is really important.
Right.
It highlights that the protection of free speech, while seemingly broad, might come with conditions and limitations depending on your immigration status.
It's not a universal guarantee.
Exactly. The main takeaway is that free speech for non-citizens in the U.S. is way more complicated and nuanced than simply reading the First Amendment might suggest.
There's this constant push and pull between these big constitutional ideas and the reality of how immigration laws are enforced.
Right. It's a really complex issue.
It is. So as you go about your day, listening to conversations about free speech, even participating in those conversations, take a moment to think about this. Given everything we've talked about, given the legal gray areas, what does it really mean to have free speech? If your very right to be in the country depends on the opinions you express.
It's a question that makes you think about the true scope and limitations of free speech in today's interconnected world.
It really does.
It's a question worth pondering.